Came here from Xano Support, and today we're going to go ahead and explore the top 5 things to do before you launch your Xano application. Now, we understand that not all apps are built the same. With that in mind, we're approaching this with a top considerations for most applications so that you watching this can watch it and go ahead and execute as well. So let's go ahead and proceed with our OpenAI Generator app and see what we can do before we launch our application. Now, before we go ahead and get started with our review generator and looking into the application to explore the top 5 things we do before we launch, I want to keep in mind that this application isn't necessarily going to be like your application. However, the ideas and principles that we're going to be going over can definitely be taken from this application and put into yours. So let's go ahead and get started at the top of the list with security, number 1. Within our API groups, we can go ahead and select here on the left-hand side. We can navigate to our API groups and select these groups, which are going to be holding our API endpoints. For this example, we'll be with OpenAI Review Generator group. Within this group, we have our endpoints categorized. On the right-hand side of each endpoint, we get to see whether or not they're public or they're private. If we select this logging endpoint here, it's a public endpoint, which means I can go to my run and debug and I can run this. Now, if anybody has this endpoint URL, they'll be able to do the exact same thing. So before we launch our application, we want to make sure that all of the endpoints that are going to be returning sensitive information or accepting information from users that we want to have logged in, we want to make sure that this public endpoint button's clicked. And then for our authentication, in the dropdown, we select user authentication or the table that's authenticated. We'll go ahead and click save. And you can see here now we have this auth token in our run and debug. This auth token is going to represent that signed in user, so you can test from here. And now if anybody wanted to use this endpoint outside of your application without being logged in, they wouldn't be able to. Clicking publish just makes sure that that's set live, and then we can continue on with a review of our endpoints and our API groups, ensuring that all of the ones that should be private are. Now, the next thing I want to cover are CORS rules. What I'd like to do, I'd like to demonstrate this with the endpoint, our logging endpoint that we went over. So what I'm going to do with our logging endpoint is simply go back to our settings and remove that authentication. I'll publish it so that the changes are live, and I'll go ahead and grab that endpoint URL. On the right-hand side, we have the ability to select those 3 dots and select our CORS management. As you can see at the moment, right now, our CORS management is set to default, essentially allowing any front end and allowing any browser to make requests to our information, our endpoints, and have a response returned. For instance, if we were to go to WeWeb and make this request with this endpoint that we've copied and click test, you can see that we actually do get our data back. If we go back inside the Xano and select our custom rules, we can select more options, which provides us more granular control over who can access our data. We have the ability to select which particular methods are able to be used and if certain origins are specified and allowed to be used. We'll go ahead and disable our GET request here, or our GET method. Back inside WeWeb, since we're making a GET request, we should expect an error since we are no longer permitting these web requests to go through. And that's precisely what has happened. CORS rules are going to ensure that the front end or a client's browser is only going to be able to make the request that you're allowing. You can go ahead and ensure that these methods are used, or you can say that they're not used. And you can also specify origins, saying from a particular website. For example, if we do mywebsite.com and specify GET requests, knowing that this is a GET request and in our example it's previously worked, we'll go ahead and specify our allow origin here and click save. Back in WeWeb, I'll attempt to test this again, and you can see here that we get the network error. With WeWeb, you do have the ability to proxy your request. CORS is going to be specifically for how frontends or browsers are going to communicate with the backend. Keep that in mind as you're building your application and ensuring security rules, which sort of goes into the next part. While CORS is absolutely going to help with security, another consideration is whether or not we should be exposing these endpoints even to begin with. What I mean by that is, well, each endpoint has the ability to be internal or external facing. We can go ahead and click on this logging example, and in the settings in the top right-hand corner, we can go ahead, click on setting, and we'll navigate down to where it says external access. Hovering over this icon lets us know that this is helpful for hiding this request if it's not production ready, which means that I have the ability to disable this and click save and publish it. So no matter if it's public or if it's an authenticated endpoint, I can go back into WeWeb and I can go ahead and test this value, where we'll go ahead and receive a 404 because it's been removed from being visible. So we've gone over authentication and ensuring that the endpoints are either public or private. We've also gone over CORS rules, and we've also gone over internal versus external access, being able to hide those endpoints from the world. Another consideration here is our Swagger documentation. Our Swagger documentation is essentially going to be the endpoints and directions for how to use our application for developers. You have the ability to hide this information by navigating to your API group within your settings, clicking on your settings, and then navigating to the Swagger dropdown, where you can either set it as private, where it requires a token, public, where it's always exposed, or disabled. If we go ahead and click Save and try to navigate back into our Swagger, we'll refresh this page, and you can see that it's no longer available. So hiding these pieces of information and ensuring security, at least at this level, is definitely what you want to do before you launch your application. Now we can go ahead and navigate on to, well, specifically logging. With this endpoint that we're dealing with, logging, it only makes sense to include within our application. It's helpful for being able to understand the user's journey and if there were ever any issues with the logic or anything of the sort. Let's go ahead and navigate to our review generator, the main meat and bones of our project. We can see here that it's going to get a record from a restaurant. A user will pass in an integer of a restaurant and some notes about this restaurant. It'll go ahead and send to OpenAI, where then we'll return the review. That review will be added to a record in our database. We then have a post process that runs where we're running a custom function called log. What I like to do is create custom functions just like this. It's going to accept a couple different pieces of information, such as our user, the message, the name, and whether or not it's an endpoint. Now, this is customizable. This is, of course, your creation, and you can decide what information you want to collect. For me, I have messages in an enum list or an enum format where I'm only going to be collecting certain pieces of information that I know of or that I care to collect. And so I'll just have them in these hard-coded values. For the name, I'll specify where this log exists and if it's an endpoint or if it's a function. But again, feel free to explore with whatever information you want to collect. Another consideration for logs isn't necessarily just at any point in your business logic, but it could be useful for errors and for error tracking, where within try-catch statements, you can include a log function that writes to your data table and stores information about what went wrong or why that error happened. Now, logging is important. It's a form of organization in the sense that we're tracking information and we're storing it away so that we can go ahead and very easily in the future look at it and see what we're dealing with. In the same way, we want that to apply to our application. What I mean by this is going through our endpoints and by going through our functions and going ahead and heading to our settings and adding descriptions and adding tags. For logging, we can say this gets our logging list. And for this tag, I can go ahead and add a tag called logging and select add. You can see here we can add even more than one tag. So this is for logging and for information, which when we're back in our API group, we can go to the search bar at the top and we can very easily search for, well, that particular tag. In addition to that, what we can do, of course, we have the ability to hide our endpoints if we don't think that they're production ready, but we also have the ability to move them and or delete them, depending on whether or not we feel they'll be important to use in the future. Moving them looks like this, where you click on this checkbox and you select these dots and you select this move, where you can go ahead selecting the entire logging group, either create a new API group for this specifically or add it somewhere else. Since organization here is the name of the game, we'll go ahead and add this to its own logging group. And we'll say this group holds endpoints for logging. I'll go ahead and add that tag here, and we'll go ahead and keep that Swagger information private and click save. We'll move those endpoints, and then we're automatically brought to that new group that's been created. If we click this back button, we can see that new group has been created, and in the spirit of organization is accompanying all of the other groups within our API groups. So cleaning up and pruning and tagging, of course, it helps ensure that your application is easy to navigate. And of course, getting rid of those obsolete functions and endpoints helps with memory overhead, and it helps with organization, and it helps with development. Instead of having to search through all of those functions with the same name or add-ons with the same name, getting rid of the ones that you don't use helps with development speed, helps with being able to troubleshoot, and in general is just best practice. So make sure that you're taking care of that before you launch your Xano app. Number 4 on the list is going to be unit tests. For this, we're going to go ahead and select our review generator. Again, the main meat and bones of our application where it sort of just all happens. We'll click this run and debug here, and we'll be able to go ahead and pass in some notes. So we'll just say it was yummy. We'll make sure that I'm the selected user, and we'll pass in the restaurant ID of 1. We'll click run here. And as we do so, we'll then see that response delivered. The response is being delivered as such. You can see it's been written to our review data table with this content. Underneath this information, as it's been returned, we have the ability to select this Create Unit Test button. As an example, we'll go ahead and fill out the name of Generate Response and say, are this tests that we get a response from ChatGPT? We have the ability to also select our auth tokens and whether or not we observe that auth token expiring. Our inputs are going to be hard-coded values so that we always can get an expected response. You can see here for our notes, we'll just say was yum and the restaurant won. So when we click this Create Unit Test button, it's going to take the response that we got and the inputs that we used and deliver this here. And our expect rules on the bottom of this, we can see that the response.id needs to equal 9, or the response.createdAt needs to equal this timestamp, and so on and so forth. In this unit test, when we're dealing with dynamic pieces of information, we're going to focus mainly just on that response.review. So I'll click this pencil button and I'll click these trash cans and I'll actually remove everything here. I'm going to add an expect statement. And what I'm going to want is that review value to not be null. So I'll add that response.review to not be null, and I'll go ahead and click play. When we do so, it's going to run through that again. And you can see here that we do get that green check mark. So we can say that when we run this test with these inputs, we do get a value in our response.review. So I'll go ahead and click save, and I'll publish this to make sure that my unit tests are actually saved to my endpoint. Now, we can navigate to our unit tests by selecting our library and selecting unit tests, where you can see here we have a whole dashboard that goes over all of the parts of our unit tests that we care about. It shows our coverage, whether or not they extend to our functions or all of our API groups and our middleware. We also have our test results in the top right-hand corner, going over a runtime of 7.70 seconds and also showing us our coverage across our application. This is going to be color-coded, showing us that it might need a little bit more coverage. And then, of course, our success rate here, where we can go ahead and click on this and take a quick look at the different tests that we run. We have the count of 2 here on this, and we can see that in the past, we had a unit test active. If we'd like to manage our unit testing for each of these endpoints, we can go ahead and click on the settings and select testing, where this will slide open a panel where we can then go ahead and remove or add what we'd like. So I'll go ahead and click this pencil and I'll remove this test and click confirm. Now, when we run all of our tests across our application, we can see that the test results are going to load and that we have a runtime of 7.18 seconds. Our coverage is still definitely more than lacking, and we have a 1 of 1 success rate. So before you launch your application, you should absolutely set up unit tests to ensure that when you pass in certain values, you're always going to get a response. Unit tests are exceptionally helpful for being able to go ahead and ensure that passing in particular data is going to get a response. It's also helpful for as you continue to build or revisit your application and make changes across your application, that those changes don't break anything. And if they do, that you can capture it, delivering a high quality experience to your end users. The very last thing I'd like to go over is at number 5, optimization. Now, optimization is particularly easy after you've launched your application, but we can always think about different pain points or different areas of bottlenecks within our application and think about ways to go ahead and get around those. For us in this OpenAI review generator group, we have this review/user ID/list. In this endpoint, we're going to essentially be just delivering a list of reviews. With the way that this application works, this very lightweight application, that user will sign up and sign in. They'll be able to create a restaurant and be able to write a review for that restaurant by just supplying some notes. It's after that, it's going to be public on their wall for users to go ahead and interact with. The idea of this review generator app is that a user is going to come to the website, they'll be able to select a restaurant and then be able to supply just some notes to the ChatGPT, which will then respond with a fully comprehensive review. The application essentially is just going to be a person writing a review and other people reading these reviews. Since in this case, our user who is writing these reviews isn't going to be updating the reviews every minute, we can make use of data caching. If we go to our endpoint and select our settings, we can navigate down to the very bottom here, and we can enable our response caching. Response caching is going to be very helpful for being able to deliver information very quickly. Initially, we're going to make a request to the data table or to the database, and that information is then going to be served to the user. So from user to the database back to the user. This takes some time to find that data and then serve it back, but data caching is going to, the first time around, is going to still perform the same. The user makes a request to the database, and then that database serves the response to the user. However, during that first request, as we have data caching on, what will end up happening is that response will actually stay in memory, so that the next user, who then goes ahead and queries that endpoint, won't be required to wait. We no longer need to go ahead and search in our database for that information. We can just reference our memory, so it's served a lot more quickly. On the right-hand side, we also have our time to live at 1 hour. So every hour, we'll go ahead and refresh that memory. And then we also have our caching signatures. We have our inputs we can use, our authentication ID, our IP address, as well as our data source. So for each request, it's going to stay in our memory. If that request is made, say, with a particular input, anytime anybody makes the same request with that input, we'll go ahead and serve the data from that memory. However, if the inputs are different, we won't serve that information from memory anymore. Instead, we'll go ahead and find that information within the data table and return it back, enforcing the cache for that signature. Data caching is best seen instead of explained. So we'll go ahead and publish this. It's enabled currently. We'll go ahead and copy this endpoint URL, and then I'll head to Postman. I am going to need to add my authorization, so I'll add that header, and I'll go back into Xano to grab the API token from the run and debug and paste it there. Now I'll go ahead and pass in a user ID. We'll say user ID of 1 in this case, and click send. You can see it took 733 milliseconds for a response to be returned to us. If we go ahead and click send again, you can see that it's now been reduced to 270 milliseconds. We'll click send again, and it's going to hover around 150 to 250 as we go ahead and query this data table. Now, of course, data caching isn't necessarily going to be applicable to all use cases. In this example, people are going to be coming to our endpoint and reading a lot of reviews. So if we can use data caching to offload some of those database resources from being used, let's go ahead and do it. If your application doesn't necessarily benefit from data caching, go ahead and give the resources in the description below a read and see if you can still benefit from those optimizations before you launch your Xano app. Thanks so much for watching with us, the top 5 things to do before you launch your Xano app. If you have any questions, go ahead and reach out in the comment section below, and you can also reach out to us in your instance by selecting the support chat. And of course, you can always shoot us a message on the community. Our team is there, and we are patrolling all the time, loving to interact and answer questions from our users. Till next time, have a good one.